Hey, it looks like everyone is here. So, welcome everyone. I'm Karen Harper. I'm the president of the Nashville Jung Circle, and we look forward to hearing Nonnie Cullipher today about her book on Robert Johnson. But first, just a reminder to keep yourselves muted until the Q&A portions of the program. And I think there's going to be three of them. And also, I'd like to remind everyone um, that you can become a member of the Nashville Jung Circle. If you aren't already, we give 9 presentations a year, and I think they're well worth the $40 membership fee, but I'm a little biased. Um, and yeah, that's it from me. I'm going to hand this over to Adele Tyler. She is our vice president and membership program, not membership, a program committee uh, person, and she is going to give the introduction for Nonnie. So, Adele.
Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce someone who's really a truly exceptional woman and a dear friend of the past 20 years, Nonnie Cullipher. Nonnie and I met in the early 2000s through Journey into Wholeness, which was a southeastern-based organization that offered conferences, vision quests, and workshops on Jungian psychology, mostly over in North Carolina. But we'll hear a little bit more about that. Nonnie was married to Sid Cullipher, whose parents, Jim and Annette Cullipher, founded Journey into Wholeness back in 1977 and led it through 30 years until it ended in 2007. Nonnie was the assistant to Sid as director for 1 year, and then Nonnie took over as the director for the final 6 years, I think, of Journey's existence. It was a very full-time job. I witnessed that. She had to help organize and conduct two twice yearly 6-day conferences that involved multiple speakers and over 20 workshops. Then there were summer vision quests up in a remote part of Canada and other seminars and events kind of mixed in. Nonnie's intelligence, her fun-loving personality, and her depth, as well as her great organizational skills, helped her create and shepherd these very memorable events they were really important to the community. This community had over 5,000 participants through the years. And for those of us who were lucky enough to attend, we still miss Journey into Wholeness. Nonnie Cullipher grew up in Seattle. She graduated from St. John's College and holds a master's degree in education and currently lives in Brevard, North Carolina, where she teaches. When I asked Nonnie for some more facts to share, she sent me this quote: I was an undergrad in philosophy and accidentally became a teacher, having now taught every subject from 4th through 12th grade, but mostly middle school language arts and history. I lived on and taught on a Navajo reservation and in a maximum security juvenile facility. Dancer, open water swimmer, solo traveler, and lover of any events that require a costume. She offered this as her, quote, strangest fact, that I once worked on Gorbachev's security detail for 1 day.
One day.
That's all we know about that. Nonnie is the mother of 2 daughters, one who's a current student at Vanderbilt, the other who lives in Huntsville and is married to a man that Nonnie described as her rocket scientist, really, son-in-law. She is the grandmother to someone she calls the cutest 3-year-old grandson ever. And I want to say just a word or two about Nonnie's husband, Sid, who was such a big part of what we'll be discussing some today with Journey into Wholeness. His spirit is part of that. He was the walking definition of a robust outdoorsman and Renaissance man. His enthusiasm for life was contagious, and his unexpected death only 2 weeks into a cancer diagnosis when he was in his 40s. That was in 2012. That came as a shock to everyone who knew him. Nonnie endured this loss with her characteristic strength and raising their daughters and embracing new challenges like editing this book about Robert Johnson that she'll be talking about today. So now I will turn it over to Nonnie.
Oh, thank you so much, Adele. I am Nonnie, and it is great to be with you guys today. I think I'll just start with a little bit of background on how this project came to be. from 1977 to 2007, there was Journey. And Adele did a very good, thorough job of telling you about Journey. I can see most of your faces. Can you raise your hand if you've been to a Journey event? Okay, a few. That's great. That's great. So you know what they do. Jim and Annette, my in-laws, founded Journey, and I married the Prince of the Kingdom and found myself in this brand new and exciting world. Sid and I took the helm in 2001, and like Adele said, he skittered away to do something else and left me holding the bag. And I was the executive director until Journey closed in 2007. So during those 30 years, many, many amazing analysts, philosophers, psychologists, artists came through the door of Journey. Just an amazing, amazing list. And some of those people came year after year and were members of the community, people that we looked forward to coming like all the time. And one of those people, and maybe the one of those people that was kind of like the wise grandfather, uncle, sage that we had was Robert. I know many of you have read his books. He had a singular gift for making really complex Jungian concepts accessible to anyone. And he's attributed to really introducing Jung to so many people in the world. And he was a brilliant lecturer, but it was his stories that I remember so clearly. I have to look at notes because I am the master tangent girl. So in 2007, when Journey closed, I donated 25 years of workshops and conferences to Jim Hollis and the Jung Center in Houston. But I bought and kept one box, and that was the box of Robert telling stories. He came to Journey once or twice a year for like 20 years. And every night of one of those conferences, he would tell stories each night. And everybody looked forward to it so much. It was such a special time together. And then we would all wander off to bed. So I kept 90 cassettes. Yeah, cassettes, not the easiest thing to work with for this project, of those stories every night. With the idea that this would make a great book for like me and the people that are in this room and love these stories and would love to be able to hear them again. It took me 12 years to do it. I quit my job and ran away and drove 9,000 miles by myself and hiked hundreds of miles in national parks and came home and was unemployed. And so I was looking at that box thinking it's now or never. If I don't do this now when I don't have something to do, it's not going to happen. So I spent several months listening to multiple versions of like a bunch of stories. And I picked out what I thought were his favorites and the ones that would most appeal to potentially a wider audience. And every single book is introduced by a fellow analyst, colleague, mentee, or friend, somebody whose life was really changed by having a personal or professional relationship with Robert. And one of those people is here with us today, Mr. Pete Williams, Dr. Pete Williams, who will be leading us in the second story that we're going to listen to. And I'll say more about him when we get there. So stories have always, I think, probably been the most important thing in my life. I was an early reader, and I think my most vivid childhood memory is being in first grade and reading a book, which I actually recently read again. It's a great book. And I realized that you could completely escape your life by reading a story. And I had the kind of childhood that you might want to escape. And so it became this huge, huge gift for me to be able to do this. I would pretend that I was all the characters in the book. I wanted to know what it was like to live where they lived and experience what they experienced and think their thoughts and feel their feelings. And then I went on to become an English teacher to try to share that joy with others. Robert would say that you could listen to a story, and some of these are all quotes, and that if you've seen Robert, you've heard these before, like a child could, just purely for enjoyment. Or you could unpack that story and it would serve as a roadmap for you to do deep and significant inner work. He would often say, I can't do a good Robert voice. Nobody can do a good Robert voice. Who is the king? Who is the wise man in you? Who is the heavenly maiden? Who is the monster? Who is the fool in you? And it was his idea that you would, look at each of these characters as aspects of yourself. And I think that that's what I have been doing all along as a kid in a, much less sophisticated fashion. And that's why his stories hit me so hard and why I wanted to put this book together. So here's the format that you can expect for our time together this afternoon. We're going to listen to either 3 or 4 stories. And those stories are Robert. These are audio clips of Robert telling stories at these conferences, the same stories that we heard, the recordings are from those nights. And a disclaimer, these recordings were made between 1981 and 2001 onto cassettes, and they were in large auditoriums with people moving about. And so you'll hear plenty of imperfections in the sound. And you'll also hear Robert's kind of precious, grunty, throat clearing sound, which if you've ever seen him speak, you know what I'm talking about. And the more you heard that sound, the more you loved that sound. And it was just part of all the stories. So it's a super treat to hear his voice again. Robert died about 6 years ago. He lived to be 97 years old. So it's wonderful to hear him speak again. So for our first story, I wanted to start this afternoon with a Hindu story called Heaven's Emissary. My friend Frank Roth, who was a close mentee of Robert's, and also did the introduction to this story in the book, called this, the spiritual story. But he wasn't talking about the kind of spirituality that would allow you to transcend the world. This was the kind of spirituality that would ground you further in it, and that was only possible once you had completely fallen in love with life. So this recording is a little less than 5 minutes. And I hope you enjoy it, and we'll discuss it when it finishes. So go ahead, let's hear Heaven's Emissary.
Gathering information. And by chance the emissary walked. Long ago, the gods in the heavens were a little bit concerned about what was going on the face of the earth. So they sent an emissary down. And the emissary was looking about, gathering information. And by chance, the emissary walked on a road and found a man sitting beside the road in the deepest meditation and in the most austere circumstances that a human being is capable of doing. He was sitting so still and had subdued all of the human things as much as he possibly could. He was so still that birds had built a nest in his hair, and a beehive had encased his right shoulder. Well, a man from heaven thought this was just a little bit strange, but the meditator realized, sensed that a man from heaven was nearby. So he came out of his trance and said to the man from heaven, will you inquire the next time you're in heaven, how many or how long before I will be released from this veil of tears? And the man from heaven said, all right. He walked on. He saw a young man dancing under a banyan tree. And the man from heaven was curious about this. So he went over. The man didn't stop dancing, but conversed with the man from heaven. The man from heaven said, what are you dancing for? And the young man said, I'm dancing for my liberation. And next time you're in heaven, will you please inquire and find out how long before my liberation? So the man from heaven said, all right. Some years later, the man from heaven was back on earth on some sojourn again. And he hunted up the meditator as he had promised. He woke the man up, said, I've inquired in heaven of how long before your liberation. And the gods have decreed that it will be 7 incarnations before you are freed. And the man groaned, moved, birds flew away from the nest in his head, and the bees buzzed ominously. And the poor man nearly lost it, and he said, what? So long? You mean I have to meditate for 7 incarnations, 7 whole lifetimes before I'm freed from this awful veil of tears? The man from heaven was consoling, but he said, yes, that's what the law says. So the man breathed deeply and resumed his meditation. 7 incarnations. How shall I bear it? The man from heaven went on, found the man dancing under the banyan tree, called to him, and said, I have inquired how long before your liberation. And the decree from heaven is that you will be freed from this veil of tears in as many incarnations as yon banyan tree has leaves. Banyan trees are very big trees. Yeah, in extensity, they're the biggest trees in the world. And the young man whooped for joy. And he said, what? So soon? And at that moment, a voice came from heaven and said, thy liberation is this moment.
I hope you enjoyed that one. One of the things I love about this story is it personally speaks to me significantly about it's such a reminder that spiritual growth and spiritual work isn't always toil. I'm used to toil and struggle, and I have to be reminded that it's not always this painful struggle, and that with so many things in the world so painful and such a mess right now, that really our spiritual paths can provide such a balm and so much peace in that process. But I'd love to see what the participants think about that story. If it was just entertaining, or if anything about it struck you more deeply. Anybody have any thoughts or questions or reflections? Anybody heard that story before?
I had a sense. It reminds me of an application called Headspace. where it's talking about being present, present with what's going on. And the thought there is especially that if you have something difficult that's happening, that's the time to really try to be present with it, because to not resist it and to be with it. So this story, that the sharing the joy of dancing, and then that was something that liberated him, seems very much consonant with that point of view.
Mhm. Anybody else? All right.
Yeah, Nonnie, I just,
Hi, Pete.
first of all, it's so wonderful to hear Robert's voice. And one thing that immediately struck me, I don't know if you all pick up on, Robert's really telling the story. He's not reading it. And I was mindful of Freud says the dream is the telling of the dream. And for Robert, it's really, it's about as much about Robert's telling of the story than the story, where he embellishes, where he exaggerates. You can sort of sense maybe some of his projections in the story, and his wonderful capacity to delight in simple things comes through it.
Totally. Listening to those recordings for so long, and I probably listened to, I don't know, at least 12 versions of Heaven's Emissary, and they were always different. And he always put in something different. And so you knew, yes, exactly what you were saying, that it came from, where he was in that moment, and
Yes,
what he was creating in that moment. Like, that story may exist, but he's creating it as he goes.
Yeah.
That was a well-timed comment, because you're up next, Pete. This is my dear friend, Pete. And Pete and Virginia and Dan and Adele were all on the board of directors of Journey into Wholeness. I'm going to give you his official biography because it's very impressive. So Pete's a Jungian analyst in Atlanta, where he has been practicing for 23 years. He has a PhD in depth psychology from Pacifica, and psychoanalytic training and diploma from Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He served there as the director of training and still participates in training analytic candidates. And he's also on the faculty of the Memphis Atlanta Training Seminar. And he did all of that after a successful 25-year life as an executive in the food manufacturing industry. And he is charming and wise and a heck of a lot of fun. If you ever get to hang out with that guy, you will be lucky. So take it away, Pete.
Thanks, Nonnie. And what I would add is that Robert Johnson was a really significant figure in guiding me through that life turn that I made from business to the world of soul and psyche. So we're going to hear the story. And before, though, I wanted to just say a couple of things, general remarks and specific to the story. As we all know, Carl Jung was an ardent and avid student of fairy tale, myth, and of course story. And his interest was primarily because he understood and grasped that story, embedded in story, are rich fields of archetypal imagery and themes and motifs that we need. And of course, there are differences between story, fairy tale, and myth. I'm not sure we need to get into that now, but so Jung saw story as similar to a dream, which also is rich with archetypal imagery and theme most often. The dreams are, as many of you may know or do know, are often so multi-layered. They're full of different levels and sources of meaning and possible insight for us. So as we listen to this story, the king and the sannyasin, I believe, if somebody can correct me, I'd welcome that. But I'd invite you to listen to it think about it as a dream. Nonnie, you sort of alluded to this, and you early on intuitively began to hear story somewhat as a dream, to see yourself embedded in the story, the characters as different parts of yourself. So I invite you to do the same with this, and with particular, listen with an attitude of curiosity as to meaning, different levels perhaps of meanings in the story. There's an obvious sort of moral tale to the story that comes out at the end, and I'm not spoiling anything, it's quite obvious, but I think there's more, and hopefully we could play around with that, see if anything comes to any of you. So.
All right. The king and the sannyasin.
It was the king's custom to go down and cross the river and seat himself like anyone else, to hear the teachings of an old wise man who spoke every morning under a banyan tree. And the king had arranged so that he was treated like any of the other listeners. All were equal in the eyes of the old wise man. This went on day after day, a beautiful time, fine teaching from the old wise man. One of the other participants was a sannyasin. A sannyasin is a wandering monk. He wears an ochre-colored robe, and he owns nothing but a begging bowl and his 2 loincloths, one of which is hanging on the wall to dry. One day, some worm got into the sannyasin, and he got very unhappy and jealous. He went to the old wise man, and he said, "This is not fair. I've given up everything except my begging bowl and my 2 loincloths, one of which is hanging on the wall to dry. And the king is given up nothing. There's his palace across the river. He has his harem, he has his servants, and he has everything, and all of his gorgeous clothing. But you treat him with just as much respect and deference as you do me, and I don't think it's fair." Well, if you ask a wise man a question or challenge him in India, he rarely answers on the spot, but it's a custom that sometime within the next 24 hours or so, he will hide the answer to your question in some observation just as it goes by. And you must be wise enough and alert enough to see the answer to your question, even though it might be tucked into the middle of another paragraph. That was the case with this wise man. Next day they met. There was the palace on the far hill. Here was the king, being very quiet, sitting like an ordinary commoner. There was the sannyasin, who had given up everything in the world except his begging bowl and 2 loincloths, one of which was hanging on the wall to dry. The wise man was talking along very quietly, and the messenger arrived for the king, whispered something in his ear. The king nodded. Another messenger came, more urgent, and whispered loudly in the king's ear. The king nodded. Yet another messenger came and was so excited he shouted his message across a group of people. There's a fire bearing down on the royal palace, and the palace may burn. The king nodded. And the little group, having heard all of this, became agitated. They watched, and they could see the smoke across the river. And they watched as the flames bore down on the palace. They were horrified to see the flames reach the palace, consume the outer walls, and soon the whole palace had gone up in smoke. The king sat there quietly. The fire raged on, came down to the edge of the river, jumped the river. Presently they could smell the smoke. Soon they could hear the crackling of the fire. Soon they could feel the heat of the fire. And the sannyasin grew so agitated that he jumped up in the middle of all of this and dashed to the wall and snatched up his extra loincloth, which was hanging on the wall to dry, and began to run. He looked around in a moment. No fire. There was the palace, serenely on the mountain side across the river. There was the king listening to the old wise man. And he came back in considerable consternation and said to the wise men, but what happened? And the old wise man said, now, who was attached to his property?
So, as I said, there's a rather obvious moral to the story, to the tale. That is getting attached to things, questioning that. But I wonder what else, if anybody, what else you heard in the story, and anything, what a figure, anything that caught your interest. Any thoughts? Well, again, if we were to think about this, or I thought about this a little bit as a dream, the first figure we're introduced to is the holy man. But he's also, and now I'm going more by the, I don't know if you all have the book, but anyhow, it's the holy man, the first figure we meet is a teacher. So if we're thinking about, again, as a dream, we might wonder what's the teacher in us? Teachers generally teach us what we don't know. As Robert would say, what we don't know but need to. And so that's where the story opens, with that sort of setting the tone of this is what's going to happen. There's going to be learning going on. And again, think about that psychologically. Some sort of psychological growth, or at least the potential for it. Then we meet the king. And the story is so careful to depict the king as the language in the book, a fine king. He runs the kingdom beautifully. So he's I don't know, what is he closely identified with? An ego of some sort, that part of ourselves that's has our outer lives ordered. It's a possibility. And then the third figure, of course, we find is the sannyasin, who's a religious aesthetic, but he's contrasted to the holy man, isn't he? And then there's one, I think, just to sort of complete what I think is the drama of the psychodynamic drama in the story. There's a line in the book, anyhow, fate doesn't always leave things as they were. If you recall in the story, the setup, there's the holy man, the king, the religious aesthetic, listening, and then something happens. Well, it's the fire. But that fate, we might think of as the self. It's going to stir things up. It's going to make things happen. In this case, the fire. And we wonder then what might the fire be? Well, I think we all know that in our lives, something that springs up, that disrupts, that destabilizes our sense of, psychologically, our sense of safety, stability, comfort. It's I think for those of us who are trying to pay attention, fires like this are a necessary part of our individuation process. They are the things that spring up, that cause us to make changes, to realign ourselves, to reflect on things. And so that's sort of the setup of the dream. And then I just sort of wrap all that together. I think this, seen this way, the story is about, actually, as was the first story, it's about listening. It's about how we listen to the teaching, to the teacher, meaning the unconscious, the self. What sort of attitude do we turn? In the first story we heard, it was simply that shift in attitude of acknowledgement and acceptance of the 7 manifestations of the leaves on the banyan tree. That changed everything. And I think here too, it's the lesson is, the Sonny-san, initially, he challenges the teacher. Why aren't you paying more attention to me? You're treating me no differently than the king, or you're not showing me respect. Jung has in one of his in the collected works, he makes a statement that the self, so our inner teacher, our inner holy man, the self turns to us, meaning our egos, the face that we turn to it. Well, the king is fully turning his face to the teacher. So we would see that maybe as the ego turning to the self, paying attention to our dreams, coming to workshops like this, reading Robert Johnson, reading Jung. Those are turns to the self. And Jung's point is the self responds to that. The Sonny-san initially does not. He rejects the holy man. He's mad at him. He turns his face away, essentially. And so the holy man does to him. In the end, there's sort of a realignment of relationship. There's, as in the first story, there's a dialogue between, an intrapsychic dialogue going on, if you will. Does that make, I'm sure any of you might have see your own dream in this story, and I'd love to hear that.
I was just thinking about the sannyasin, and how similar he strikes me as the man meditating for so long and so stilly. I love the image of the beehive on his shoulder because he's so still, and that groan, 7 more incarnations,
Mm-hmm.
and and that bitterness, that I'm working so hard, both of them. I'm working so hard. That guy has it so easy. And thinking about what the what that guy would say if he knew that dancer had just been liberated right then, like him, he's just dancing. Look at me, I'm working so hard. And the other thing I just always think about, I just wonder what's going through the mind, or maybe there is no mind at that time when the king is hearing about the kingdom being under threat. What is causing him so much peace? What is causing him to maintain all of his focus on the teacher? Actually reminds me of a story we're going to listen to a little later too, but that was just some musings I had listening to it. I always think about something different every time I hear those stories.
Yeah, and well, yes, Nonnie, that's a great point. What is going on with the king? Again, I think or at least at one level, what's going on with the king is simply his attunement. It's that idea. We just have to show up. We have to be open to what the unconscious, what the self, what our inner resources offer us and have to say. And he understands that. And the aesthetic doesn't. The Sannyasin does not. He doesn't understand. That's the lesson he has to learn. So yeah, you're right, Nonnie.
Linda Odom had a point.
I was just thinking about I don't know how to put this, first there was a fire, then there was no fire. It was like there was an element of illusion to reality in the story. And I like that you approached it as, well, what if we thought of this as a dream? It's very dreamlike. But it made me think about, I do psychodrama, so it made me think about, what if we looked at our lives as a psychodrama, something that we're setting up for the moment for our own teaching, but something that isn't a reality that is on and on, is an eternal, solid reality. And what if we thought of our lives as being set up for us to help bring us into greater consciousness, instead of looking for the next crisis to bemoan?
The perceived fire. Like, now I'm just imagining all the messengers that came to the king as, just aspects in the king, like to trying to distract him from what he is there to learn. And there's no fire, but they're trying to tell him there's a fire, and how often and how easy it is to be in that space.
Rocky Ortega had a question.
Well, thank you for hearing. So for me, the lesson that I was picking up was that if you're going to go to a wise man and really want to be there, don't go as a king, be as a commoner. So the king wasn't sitting there as being the king of the domain. He was like everybody else. So don't be so presumptuous. I think that's my issue. Sometimes I think I'm so damn smart that I'm a stupid fool. That's how smart I am. So anyway, that's my feedback.
And Natalie had her hand up.
Yeah, I was just, what came up for me around the fire was that, or what it's kind of bringing up for me, it's just the sannyasin's kind of sacrificial life, and the way he was acting, or, the way he was sacrificing so much, and thought this was going to give him, either wisdom or whatever he was seeking, but that the fire showed up despite himself. And and the change or a step towards transformation happened despite his own stumbling, efforts in life. And I just kind of think about that, like the grace around the fire showing up, even though it didn't really exist. I don't know. That's what the psyche showing up and showing up on your behalf in some way. It's kind of what it
Yes.
means for me.
Yeah, I think so. I think that the fire is an image of, again, using Jung's language of the notion of the self, as he calls it he calls it a number of things, but one is the organizing principle of the psyche, with overseeing both our conscious and our unconscious life. So there's something, that's what's orchestrating, to your point, orchestrating the fire. The fire is to get things moving. There's another at the end of the tale, the Sannisan's impulse is to grab his loincloth off wherever it was, off the tree, to save it. And that Jung talks a lot, describes what Jung calls the phenomenon of, he calls it regressive restoration of the persona. And he defines it as when in the face of trauma, so in this case, when in the face of a fire, a threat, there's an impulse in all of us to regress, to put everything back the way it was. It's the archetypal theme of the Humpty Dumpty story. It's a common theme, but that impulse, as Jung says, to regress, and the regress to go back to what we knew, what was before, to restore, to put back, and to go back, to put back. And that's what we see. That's the impulse of the Sannisan, but he's sort of busted, isn't he, by the holy man. He kind of says, oh, well, I see what you're doing. You're not willing to be progressive. You're not willing to listen to the teachings. So it's, sorry, I strayed a bit from your comment, didn't I? Oh, geez.
And Gerd, it looked like you have your hand raised, or did. There you go.
I was going to say, I can't really speak to the dream aspect. I'm not experienced enough in analyzing my dreams. But what struck me was really what was said at the end as the moral of the story, and that was this word attachment, right? I mean, I know in my own life how, even though I know better, but all these filters that I've grown up with, all these things that have created sort of an illusion, so to speak, and seeing things, let's say, like the Sannisan that with a king, like he has all these things, he is wealthy, and and you treat him differently because of it, and on and on. And then suddenly he realizes when the fire could be, I take that as sort of this illusionary thing that suddenly the wise man cuts through and saying, like, now see, that it's really about not what you have, but what you're attached to. And that his attachment's actually getting him into being so miserable. Because you can have very little, you can have as little as a little bowl, or own very little, but be totally attached to it and holding on to that for dear life. And so it's not about really, for me, like what I see in the story, what I hear in the story is, what I own or what I have, whether material or in terms of like what I think of myself, that ego that someone referred to. but attachment, how attached am I to things, and how that can actually be a real stumbling block in my own, let's say, way to individuation, if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
I keep getting the word surrender because they're both faced with the reality that they may have to surrender, and how challenging surrender is. And the king just nods. The castle's gonna burn, king. Everything's gonna be destroyed. And he's willing and he's ready, and he can face that surrender. And the sannyasin just runs and grabs that loincloth, because it doesn't matter if it's a minor thing, it doesn't matter if it's this modest thing, he still can't surrender. And how hard it is, just to fully surrender. And that's the teaching, feeling like right now.
I'd like to make a question, and that is, especially because we've been talking about flames, it reminded me of Edward Edinger, and I believe it was in the book Origins of Consciousness, where he talks about the fire in terms of the calcinato, I think is the word he used, but it was the phoenix rising up through that fire. As I always understood that as transformation. Now, is that a completely different story, or is that related to what this story is of change?
Is that Nonnie? Do you have it?
Well, there's no transformation. I'm just still, just mulling over this idea of surrender, and how there is no transformation. There's no transformation without surrender. But I defer to you, Keith. You are far wiser than I.
I think to the question, I think very often fire is seen, whether it's in the context, the alchemical context that you refer to, or in other ways, fire is an image of transformation. I'm not sure. I'm inclined to see the fire in this dream or story more as an agent of change than actually itself transformative. I think it gets going. We often in a dream, if you think about it, often we'll have a dream, we'll describe, well, I was sitting in my mother's kitchen, and then suddenly, ever notice there's almost always then suddenly something happens. That's the Jung talks about the problem in the dream. There's a setting, there's a story, then there's a problem. That's sort of the pattern of a dream. And that this follows that a little bit. The problem's the fire, but it's what the response to the fire that where the potential for transformation is.
Are there any other questions about that one? I was hoping, Pete, you could share a little bit about your personal story of Robert. You game for that?
When I met Robert the first time, I had been told I should go by my therapist that I should go to a Journey into Wholeness conference. And I had no idea what Journey into Wholeness was. I didn't even know who the hell Carl Jung was, frankly. I was a businessman, and I thought that's all I need to know. anyhow, I went to the conference, to the Journey conference, knowing, not knowing really anybody or what the hell was going on. And I did, folks said, oh, you need to go to hear this guy Johnson, go to a workshop. So I went to one of his workshops on dreams. And he told of a dream that he had in which the whole dream was gray. In the dream, he was walking along a beach, and the sand was gray, the ocean was gray, the sky was gray, the land was gray. And I don't know what else he did with that dream. Then after that, I was walking into the dining hall for lunch, I think, and he was coming out. And it was just the two of us, and I just stopped. I didn't know enough to be intimidated by the guy, but I just said to him, Robert, you really upset me. And he didn't know what I was, and he just looked at me and put his hand on my shoulder and said, we need to talk. And then he walked away. And I had no idea what to do with that. Talk, when, how, where. Clearly, he was trying to find out if I would go to the trouble to see what that meant. Anyhow, I did. And we struck up a friendship, and he was interestingly so, and we over the years we spent time together, and he taught me a lot. He was not in favor of, when I talked to him about whether I should pursue training as a Jungian analyst, and he said, no, why? Just go do your work. Why would you do that? Don't bother. It was kind of, just go do it. Don't go train or study, just go do it. Well, I didn't listen to him, but so that's you know, Robert was not a guy that you'd say, well, I'll go, I'd love to have a beer with him. That's not who Robert was.
Right.
And he thought and talked a lot in subtle metaphor. He rarely hit things head on, particularly in a one-to-one. He had a beautiful way of talking about something else, but at the same time, really talking about what was really going on.
That's a perfect time to, I think that there are many people in this group that have a personal story about Robert, and that maybe before our next story, people could share those. I can go first. Only having been around a Journey for the last 8 years, I knew Robert a shorter period of time. And I remember him, you know, I was young and extroverted and a girl, and he was totally intimidating because I just never seen anybody so like self-contained, just almost ethereal. And, you know, and Robert was very funny, and you can hear that, you know, in his timing, in his stories. And he had this funny little, like, shiny-eyed, just like the faintest bit of a smirk. And I got it several times in the beginning. He's like, I don't know about that girl. But I was a member of the Cullipher family, and he accepted me as such. And I did have kind of many more mundane experiences of Robert than than most people. Like right now, it's popping into my head is, and I think about this all the time because I'm reminded of this, but he taught me not to drink water or anything else while I was eating because of how much that affected your digestion. I have a different kind of Robert story. And I got to have some of my dreams analyzed by him, which was a huge deal. I was a member of the Cabin 8 crew. We did a lot of our events at Canoga, and the people who ran it and all the presenters would stay in one cabin, and we would collect dreams in the morning and work on them together. And I just remember like just being, like 30 and these amazing people were talking about my dream, and it took me a little while to realize I didn't always want that to happen. Maybe I needed to not share, but I also got to hot tub with Robert. I mean, how many people can say that? Come on. Which also meant that I got to be with Robert without his prosthetic leg. When Robert was a child, he was pinned by a car and lost his leg. And if you read his biographical information, it's and Michael can tell us more about this. I'm hoping that you share, because making that movie, I know you have a lot of stories. But I still treasure that as this like intimate and sweet thing. But the biggest thing that ever happened for me with Robert was at my first vision quest in Temagami, Northern Ontario. I was completely petrified. And, so many people there were afraid, I'm not going to get a vision. I'm not going to get a visitation. And I'm like terrified. I'm going to get a vision or a visitation, because since young childhood, I'd always been afraid of being like completely swallowed up by the spirit world. Like it wanted me and I would be irrevocably lost forever. Yes, I'm showing you lots of my psychology at the moment. And so I went to Robert's cabin and I sought him out and I told him that I was struggling, and he just, I think, nodded like the king as the fire's coming down and looked at me for a while and then looked away and kind of thought maybe he'd forgotten that I'd spoken for a while. But then he's like, Nonnie, not everybody needs a vision quest. He said, some people have been on vision quests their whole lives. And, I still work with like trying to figure out exactly what that means. But it was that permission to not go that gave me the strength to go. And, I made it back from the spirit world, barely. Anybody else? Any Robert stories? Adele, you must have one too, I'm sure.
The thing that comes to mind, the first time I went to a Journey into Wholeness event, it was down at St. Simon's Island. And I didn't know anything about Robert Johnson, not read any of his books. But anyway, I went to a workshop. I can't remember exactly what the subject was for the workshop, but it seems like we had to do some kind of writing. But the thing he kept emphasizing that stuck with me was that we then had to come up with a ritual. And we had to not just take this thing we had written or talked about or whatever, but we had to go back home when we got back to our own home and come up with a ritual. And I remember going up and asking him, because this was all so new to me. And he said, go out in your backyard and build a little fire and burn something. But anyway, that stayed with me. I also remember, I think Dan might have the story that we kind of innocently went and sat with him for lunch. He was sitting by himself and probably preferred maybe not to be disturbed, but he was kind of slightly intimidating in his self-containment and introversion. But and I kind of got the feeling, Nonnie, that he was more comfortable with talking to men. Maybe that was my own insecurity. But so I found him slightly intimidating, but he was obviously a very kind man. And so then reading his books, that comes through. But I didn't get to do a lot of interacting. But his presence, like you say, I think the thing maybe we all remember was he just had a presence about him that was kind of it was intriguing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, if you were there, he was telling me a story. He knows how to unmute himself.
And Gretchen had her hand up a minute ago, but go wait for Daniel here.
He's talking, but I don't think it's coming through.
Yeah, Dan, you look unmuted here, but we don't hear you.
I haven't even seen Dan yet.
Yeah, here, I'll go fetch him. He doesn't have a camera on his computer.
Oh, no.
Okay, Gretchen, why don't you go ahead?
You're muted, Gretchen.
Can I
Okay.
come in here?
Oh, sure. Here.
Robert gave me an invaluable gift as for my teaching. When I heard him speak many times at Journey into Wholeness, I can't remember what the person in the audience was talking about, but he tried to put Robert on the spot by challenging something Robert had said. And the person in the audience was very intellectual and wanted to know concrete examples of his question. And Robert just sat in silence. It seemed like a long time. And then his response was, I have no idea to that question. And besides that, I don't even think the way you think. My temperament is so different than that. I have to feel into such and such. And so whenever I teach and I get nervous about people in the audience and what they'll ask me, you know, that has comforted me many, many years.
Can I say something now? Can they hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dan.
I'm sorry, I've never, this is my first time to ever speak on Zoom. And my computer doesn't have a camera. The memory I have is when I met Robert Johnson, I had read several of his books. I'm sure he and she and probably a couple others. And I was somewhat in awe of him. So I approached him. I don't think it was at the lunch that Adele alluded to. I remember being outside, just he was sitting on a wall, and I just kind of went up to him and I said how much I had appreciated his books. And I said, I especially appreciate the brevity of your books, because if you know about Robert Johnson's books, they're not very long, but they're very rich and deep. And he just looked at me and said, well, I guess I have the gift of simplicity. And that really stuck with me. That's all he said. And but it did cause me to reflect and think about simplicity and simplicity as a gift. So that's what I would say. Thank you. Bye.
That's great, Dan. Bernetta, you were nodding your head. Do you have anything that you'd like to say, Bernetta? You're muted there, but. I felt that Robert Johnson helped me in my mid-20s. It was reading He, She, and We. I had fallen in love and was, he talked that really probably what was going on for me is that I was having a projection, and that's the time that it said, well, you know, actually knights and ladies was a platonic relationship, and those work a lot better. And that kind of saved my life, to be content that the longing I had was probably internal and not going to be resolved externally.
That just made me think of a funny Robert quote. You know, people joke all the time about how expensive analysis is. And Robert was like, there's only two ways to individuation: relationship and analysis. And analysis is way cheaper. Does anybody else want to share, or should we go to the next story? Okay, I think that's time for another story. So this story is called Woman at the Crossroads, and it's a little over 10 minutes. It's the longest one we'll hear today. And so I think in the interest of time, so we have time for more discussion and one last story, we'll just go ahead and hit it. So Woman at the Crossroads.
Once there was a woman, extraordinary woman, young, and for some strange reason, this is an old timers, please remember, she sat herself down at the crossroads where the north, south, east, west roads crossed. Dirt road, of course. She sat herself down next to the crossroads, stark naked. She sat there. Various people objected. Various people jeered at her. Various people tried to help her. Most people ignored her. But presently, a woman in gorgeous golden robes with pearls and diamonds sewn into patterns as ornaments came by and took pity on the poor naked woman. She took off her gorgeous robe of golden silk and pearls and diamonds and offered it to the naked woman at the crossroads. And she said, "Here, you take this. You need it more than I do." And the naked woman looked at it and said, "But it's so heavy." And the woman of the golden robe said, "Well, yes, it's heavy, but that's not the worst of it." And she said, "If you put on this robe, you have to agree to do what your wealthy husband tells you to do, and you have to be a showpiece for him. He will show you off, he will show all of his wealth off by way of the wonderful clothing which you wear. And you may not make decisions of your own. You must always be at the beck and call of your husband, your wealthy husband, and gauge everything you do in terms of whether it reflects well on him." The girl without clothing said, "No, that's much too heavy." So she took the robe and she put it down beside her. And the woman who had been clothed in the golden robe came and sat down beside her robe. She wouldn't put it back on either. And some time passed, and more people came and went, and some people jeered, and some people ignored, and some people gawked, and just what you would expect. And a woman in a very plain gray dress came by. She said, "I've taken pity on you, you poor naked thing. You don't have to lie there in the ignominious situation you're in. You don't have to be naked. Here." She took off her plain gray dress and gave it to the naked woman. And the naked woman looked at it and she says, "Yes, that's better than the big heavy one with pearls and diamonds on it, but it's still too heavy." "Why is it heavy?" She hefted it in her hand and she said, "This is too heavy for a woman to put on." And the woman who had taken off the gray dress said, "Well, if you wear that dress, you give up all of your freedom. You may never get rested. You may never have a vacation. You won't have time to be sick ever. You can't do anything of your own. You'll be busy cooking and washing and diapering and managing and being the head of a household, which is pretty much a 24-hour-a-day job. But it's a nice dress." And a naked woman said, no, I could never put on that much of a weight. That's too heavy. I'd rather be naked. They waited a while. The woman of the gray dress also sat down next to her dress. Wouldn't go away. And in due time, another woman, flashy, flamboyant woman in a very short, bright, brilliant red dress came by. And she said, "You poor thing, lying there naked. You don't have to do that. I will give you my dress. See, it's easy. It slips on and off in an instant." And the naked woman hefted it in her hand, and she says, "It's very heavy. Why is it so heavy?" The woman of the red dress says, "Well, yes, it is heavy. If you wear that dress, you have to be in the beck and call of any man who wants you. And your life will be a series of unknown men who don't stay." So the naked woman said, "No way will I put that dress on." So they waited a while. And of course, the woman from the red dress sat down beside her dress, and they were waiting. Presently, a nun came by with her nun's habit on, and she saw the girl with no clothing and said, "Here, poor child, you may have my dress. It's a dress of safety." So the naked girl took it and hefted it in her hand, and she said, "It's so heavy." And the nun says, yes, it's true, it's heavy. Because you will serve many people, and you will counsel many people, and you will help to raise children, but you will never have children. And you will help women who have a husband, but you will never have a husband. And you will know the safety of God, but you'll never know the joy of being a human being. So the girls said, "No, I won't put that one on." So the nun of the habit put her dress down, sat down beside it. So a very long time passed. More people came, more people went. Maybe there were more offerings, but they're not recorded in our story. And finally, some odd kind of alchemy sprang up among these 5 women, or certainly among 4 of them. Not so sure about the original naked woman. And they began to talk, and each was telling the story of her life, and how great it was to be in the convent and to be safe, and how exciting it was to live in a brothel and have a whole succession of men coming and going. The trouble is, they always went. And the householder said, it's so fine to have your own children, but you don't have your own life. And you spend all of your energy being the household and the backbone of a household. And it's good, but that's very lonely too. And the wealthy woman said, "Well, it's such a joy to parade before the neighborhood, show off the gowns of my wealthy husband, but it's always for him. All this is for his benefit or for his prestige. Nobody ever looks at me as me." And one of the most awful things about this, I forgot to tell you, was that you must never get old. You must never leave your shape. Otherwise, you will go through the agony of seeing a glint in your husband's eye as he looks for beauty elsewhere. Well, the four didn't know what to do. Something was percolating, energy was accumulating. So finally, inventive as woman can be, they took the four costumes and they cut it up and they made a kind of a synthesis, so that there was a bit of each of these costumes in each of four dresses for the four women. And they put them on and they paraded and they were pleased and they talked and they walked around the naked girl. And she said, "No way." And went to a new crossroads.
I admire this naked woman. You know, she's self-contained. She doesn't care if people make fun of her. She doesn't care if people ignore her. But I'm also a little confused by her. This story has always confused me a little bit. One of the things that I have done a lot through my life, when a story really grabs me in any way, sometimes I try to write the next piece that goes with that story, the next thing that happens. It helps me work through some things, and I enjoy the writing. And I think if I was going to do that with any of the stories in this book, it would be this one. Because I like to imagine her response to women that might approach her that are, you know, not one-dimensional and more integrated. I wouldn't have put on any of those dresses either, but I can't help but feel like she's not 100% self-contained, and that she might be open to, you know, were there any other kind of dresses that would have appealed to her? You know, she's sitting at a crossroads. She's not sitting under the banyan tree. She's not sitting on the top of a mountain all by herself. To sit at crossroads makes me feel like she's open to something, and I don't have any idea what. So, anybody have any thoughts about this story? Keats' wife, Virginia, wrote the introduction for this story, and the introduction takes the form of an active imagination between Virginia and the woman at the crossroads. It's really interesting.
Can you tell us what she says, essentially?
I think, I don't know, Pete, can you tell her what she says? I mean, I know, but there's so much Virginia in it that I wonder if it's better from you. Oh, yeah, we've got the book. It's a different kind of response than mine, and I don't know. I don't know if you'd want to hear that whole thing.
But why is I'm feel disturbed, actually. Is there a story about a naked man at a crossroads? Why is this a naked woman?
Good question. And it's always interesting when Robert tells stories about women. You know, Adele was right when she said, "Yeah, I always thought he was more comfortable talking to men." Yeah, it's a good question. That'd be another great story to write. What would the man sitting at the crossroads, you know, what would his reaction be to other men?
Nonnie.
Gail, go ahead, Gail.
Yeah.
Maybe when she goes to that second crossroads, she meets a naked young man. Maybe that's the part of the story.
Maybe. Yeah, it's difficult. I can't, you know, not believe that there I do think that it would not be a crossroads she was sitting at if there wasn't something that, you know, that she
Definitely, it's
open to.
yes,
to
open.
I think it has something to do with that. I think Robert Johnson was more comfortable with men, and that's an issue here.
Mhm. Could be. But I like to imagine what dress she might have said, oh, all right, I can put that one on.
A thought about this playing around we're doing with it. This story is about a woman. What would a man be? And I think it helpful if we think about it more in terms of this is a story about the feminine.
Mhm.
And it's the plight of the feminine. So it's the
And it's not
feminine
about men and
within
women.
with all men too. So men are in the story. It's our feminine that is struggles with being known
Mhm.
and wants to be seen for who, as this woman in the story, for seen for who she is, not we could think of it in terms of these other four women are very persona identified. Their identity in the world is to a role or a function, something outside of themselves. This woman is maybe not fully consciously, but intuitively almost understanding that none of those personas will satisfy the longing. Excuse me.
I think that's an incredible point.
Well, it also reminds me of the virgin goddesses, one and two herself, so that's another way I think to sort of look at this. She didn't need all these trappings based on what men thought of her or how they could use her. So, which is maybe another reason she went to another crossroad. It just didn't fit.
Mhm.
This story made me very uncomfortable, the nakedness of it, and sitting with the discomfort. I think the nakedness is the best word I can think of for an individuation journey, that we have to completely, continually become undressed.
That's wonderful, Gretchen. Dan, you're muted. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, to me, the four women are the heroines of the story. And somehow the woman, the naked woman at the crossroads, to me is a negative space. And these women come to assist this person or to offer assistance. And she resists and refuses, and it's always too heavy, too much. Whereas these other four women are living their lives, engaging in life, whether it's in a brothel or as the wife of a rich man or housewife or whatever, or a nun. And then they incorporate all those elements. And I think those four women are the ones who are actually liberated. That's my take on it.
I have a take. I think what's coming up for me with the naked woman, though, for me is like the evocative nature of the soul. So I'm seeing it very differently. I think I just sort of, and the fact that all of that felt like a weight and none of it quite fit or wasn't right. And again, like Nonnie, your point, I'm not sure what dress she would accept or the purpose of, and the going to another crossroads, I feel like I need to hold that longer, and just like, I'm not sure where that's going. But yeah, I feel like the nakedness was just like the evocative sort of soul piece. Yeah, where are the crossroads going? I don't know.
Anybody else before we go to our last story? All right. So our final story is The Rainmaker, and it's very short and very rich. And I'm sure that many of you know this story because it is so ingrained in the Jungian world. But I'll give you a little background on it if you have not heard it. So Richard Wilhelm is the translator of the I Ching. And in his early 20s, he went to China as a missionary, and he stayed for almost 20 years and was extremely impacted by Chinese philosophy and spirituality, and then spent the rest of his life trying to create a bridge between that Eastern and Western thought. And Jung met Wilhelm at the School of Wisdom in Darmstadt, Germany. And he introduced him to the secret of the golden flower. Wilhelm introduced Jung to the secret of the golden flower, which was a meditation manual that sparked Jung's interest in alchemy as a tool for depth psychology. And Jung said that he may have learned more from Richard Wilhelm than any other person in the world, which is saying a lot. And the story you're about to hear is Robert tell is a story that Wilhelm told Jung. And according to Robert, Jung said that this story was the most important story he'd ever heard. And that Jung said it was the most important story he'd ever heard. And Jung said, if you understood the story even a little bit, that you would know what he was trying to do in the world, which is quite an intro for a story. And it's very short. And I'm super curious what you guys make of it, because it also seems like The King and the Sannyasin, where there's like a moral or a message at the end that is pretty, obvious, but maybe it's not, or maybe there's a lot more. So we'll see what we make of it. So our last story, The Rainmaker.
The story goes something like this. There was a village in China which was besieged with drought, and they were going to be in very, very serious trouble, probably die of famine if rain did not come soon. So they tried all the local things that they knew, no rain. So they sent afar for the great rainmaker. I chuckled a little because the great people always come from somewhere afar. Somehow distance seems to make one's stature grow. Local prophets, local rainmakers, one doesn't pay very much attention to. So they sent a great distance for the great rainmaker. He came, he looked at the village, and he said, please build me a hut outside the village of rice straw, and give me 5 days of food and 5 days of water, and leave me alone, please. They did this quickly. The man disappeared into his hut with his 5 days of food and his 5 days of water. And at the end of the 4th day, it rained. And people were overjoyed because their village was saved. The crops were saved. The rain had come just in time. They went out to the hut, dragged the poor man blinking out of the darkness of his little straw hut, showered their thanks upon him, gave him his fee, gave him everything they could because he had literally saved their lives for them. And somebody said, to him, "Now, what did you do? What is this marvelous process? What is the magic? How did you make it rain?" The rainmaker said, "Oh, you see, I was so ill at ease with myself when I came into your village that I had to put myself straight before I could do any ceremonies. And I hadn't gotten to the ceremonies at all. I was only putting myself right inside." And there is the story. This opens up the very great question: what is the relationship between the inner world and a
The audio stopped there.
That's so interesting that that final line was on there. I wasn't aware of that. Anybody want to finish his sentence?
Would you repeat the unfinished sentence?
Yeah, I just wondered if anybody wanted to finish that sentence, what you think he might have said or what you might have said. What is the relationship between the inner world and then it
Oh,
ended?
yeah.
Well, I think Robert probably said outer
Yeah.
world.
I'm reminded of saying "as within, so without."
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think Jung believe when you think about astrology or you think about synchronicity, or how I know in my life, my dreams will often tell me what's coming. It's like it doesn't matter whether you put the outer straight or the inner straight, you're putting the whole straight.
Always the big Jungian question for me, if we go in our huts and we get ourselves straight. I mean, I just look around at the metaphorical droughts that, exist right now today. Is it enough for us to go into our huts and get ourselves straight?
Well, it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, what do y'all make of this story?
Maybe that it doesn't hurt it, but Linda was just saying, maybe we have no choice.
Right, it's all we can do. And if enough people did, like what kind of impact that would have on the outer world?
You know, the transcendental meditation people have done a lot of research on the effects of large numbers of people meditating on the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And on the crime rate.
But the rainmaker didn't just go into his hut. He responded to the request to come to the crisis. And then he did his inner work. So it was both.
Mm-hmm.
But he hadn't done any of the rituals, he says.
He didn't need to, yeah.
Gretchen, are you saying he took responsibility? Is that the essence of it? He took responsibility?
Yes, then he had a relationship and a call to action to respond to the need.
Yeah, Gretchen, yes, I agree with that. I think this story certainly, and really all these stories, at some level, they're stories of what happens when things get out of balance. That's well, think of Robert's. It wasn't his last book, but Balancing Heaven and Earth, balancing inner and outer. I think one way to think about the shaman in the dream or in the story is that he, by going off as he did, he represents a correction to the imbalance that existed within the community. There was a drought, dryness, brittleness. If you think about dryness psychologically, there's no moisture, there's no imagination, there's no soul. All those things are associated with the feminine, associated with moisture, with a wettening, with all of that. The masculine is more arid, more dry, more solar. So the shaman, as I see it, his function was, again, to bring balance. Once balance was restored within the psyche, that's really what we're talking about. The village is a psyche. And then once there's balance, then the nourishing moisture will show up. It's kind of the way I think of that story. The same with the Sanism and these stories. That's one way of seeing many of these stories, is thinking about balance. That Jung said that the primary driving impulse of the psyche is toward wholeness and balance. But we're by nature such split, or not by nature, by our psyches are prone to splitting into opposites. That's why Jung spent so much time talking about opposites, holding the tension of opposites, and bringing the potential to bring opposites together to create a third. It's all that. So much of what Jung writes about is, in one way or another, about the hazards of imbalance and the necessity of balance.
I had heard early on a Chinese concept of Wuji to Tai Chi, Wuqi to Tai Chi, and that Wuji is a nascent emptiness, and the Tai Chi is the yin and yang, and its essence is the yin and yang. And it strikes me that fits in a interesting way to what you've said, where we talk about polarities and divisiveness. If that Eastern concept is saying it's always going to be a yin and a yang, but maybe that's a place of balance possible.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Well, that was our last story. So those are 4 from the book. I'll have my little shameless commercial. There are 13 stories. Here's the book. So this picture was shown while some of those stories played. And then the other one, excuse me, by far, it was definitely not a professional photograph, but was taken from one of Robert's final birthdays, just maybe 2 or 3 before he died. So mid-90s. And he was wearing that beautiful Indian shirt, and India was so precious to him. I just like that picture, and he just looks like he's enjoying all the love. But if this book, Storytime with Robert, it is available it was published by Chiron Publications. And there's several introductions by people you'd recognize. And there's also an audio book through Audible. And the clips of the stories are in the Audible version. So you can hear Robert tell all of the stories. So that's a treat, and definitely makes it so much better than reading it off a page. But that, I think, is all I had for you today, unless there is anything anybody else has to add.
I'd like to make a comment. I think from the point of view of the Nashville Jung Circle, I can't think there could be a more appropriate moment for this presentation. The depth of the stories and the challenges of the stories give me the feeling that that's what we need at the moment when the world is in such a divided place, really frighteningly divided. So it's like I don't feel we could have made a more masterful moment that you have brought and Pete has brought with these stories. The stories seem to invoke so much within each of us, and I think that's what's needed at the moment, is for stuff inside of us.
I love that. And there's so much toxic certainty. So much toxic certainty. And you'll notice every single story we're like, I don't know, like being comfortable with the not knowing, and just kind of chewing on it. And, and earlier when someone shared that Robert, I think, somebody said when they asked him a question and he's like, I have no idea. And just how our current struggles and the current things that are happening right now, if everybody was less certain and more comfortable with saying, I don't know, I have to think about that longer, like how much trouble that would save us.
That's a fantastic way of stating it.
Thank you for that. All right. Well, it was such a pleasure. Everybody has my email in case there's anything you wanted to share or you have any questions afterwards. And I'm so grateful for your time today, and so happy to, it's a very small book, little niche love project that it's exciting that there's still a little bit of interest in it out there. So thank you so much for having me. And you made my day.
You made our day. And Karen and Adele, do you have something to say from the Jung Circle?
Well, I was going to say as well, Nonnie, you and Pete have made our day, and this is such a wonderful way for us to end this year's list of presentations. And I'm a huge Robert Johnson fan, so I have just, been a fangirl listening to all the stories. I'll definitely be buying the Audible. What a treat to actually hear him with all those 13 stories. So thank you all so much. And the Jung Circle will be back in January. And we wish you all a happy and safe holiday season. Let's see, Adele, do you have anything?
No,
you
I
there?
just second that we will hope to see you all back in January, and a little pitch that you can renew your membership by, January 1st, get your membership for 2024 so that you get a break on these fees, which are still reasonable. But we have 4 interesting lineups so far for January, February, March, and April. And in January, we're going to have James Newell teaching a class on the introduction to Jung, which for a lot of us, maybe it'll be kind of a refresher course. And then hopefully for people who are newer to this material, he might, cover some of the basics, but that'll be an interesting start. Then in February, John Beebe will be talking about film from a Jungian perspective, which we're looking forward to.
Did you hear that, Pete?
Yeah.
I did. Does everybody know your history with John Beebe and film? And
No.
You should tell everybody.
So when I was the director of Journey, I'm so excited. I'm coming to BB night.
Good.
I had this idea for an event, a film festival on the feminine in film. And I invited John Beebe and the lovely Virginia Apperson to head that up. And it was magnificent. And it was really exciting for me because it was my first. There were a lot of set events in Journey. You know, there's the fall conference, and you know, there's always I got say in who we hired to be speakers, but the structures were pretty set. And that was the first event that I ever put together on my own. And then John and Virginia did a book on it. Tell them more about the book.
They go off. So the book came out of the conference, the Nonnie's conference, which was held in Birmingham, and it was over 3 days, as I recall, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In any case, subsequent to the conference, Virginia and John, I guess, assumed that was that, and they were contacted by a publisher in England, Cambridge Scholars Press. And they said, we've heard about the conference. Would you be willing to publish your proceedings, or will publish the proceedings if you'll put it together? Well, as we all know, going from your lecture notes on a legal pad to a book is quite a leap. They each chose, I think, 4 films, both each, John and Virginia. So there are 8 films, I believe, in the book, and they each film is a chapter. And it's the name of the book is The Presence of the Feminine in Film. And John Beebe writes a book just for the fun of it, and it just about killed Virginia.
Well, you guys are very lucky to have him. Yeah, that's a wonderful lineup. And I interrupted you. What comes in March, Adele?
I wanted to add that I have also spoken with Virginia, and we're about the possibility to drag her out of retirement or something, Pete. I don't know if she planned on doing this, but the whole idea of the film, of the Jung Circle talking about film really excites me. We have a really active film community in Nashville, and I think that would attract a lot of people. So I'm hoping she might want to do something in the future too. So we're going to work on that. In March, we have Connie Zweig is going to be talking about her book. It's called The Inner, what is this? See, The Inner Work of Shadow and Aging, I think. Anyway, it's about aging, and it's her newest book, but it's about the shadow aspects of aging. And then in April, let's see if Gail is still on. There's a speaker. Can you tell us, Gail, about her?
Kay Lindauer, who's from upstate New York, Syracuse University area, is going to be talking about narcissism from a Jungian framework. It should be interesting.
So right now we're going to continue doing these Zoom events, and then hopefully we will add in some in-person events. Somehow we're still kind of working out how to do that, because we don't want to lose those of you who are joining us from out of town. That's been really nice. And just having like Nonnie and Pete, it's made it very possible to bring people together. It'd be hard to do if we were having to get people to fly in from all over the country. So, but please get in touch with us through our email. Our email is info@nashvillejungcircle.org. You may have ideas or questions, suggestions about programming or what you'd like to see. And also we are, Karen, I think we could say we are possibly adding some new board members in the coming year, and would like to hear from any of you who might be interested in working with us. So
I'd like to add just in closing, I hope I didn't cut you off, Adele. We've been talking so much about film in my 20s and 30s. So that's the 70s and the 80s. I spent a dozen years in the production and I was the producer of the film Matter of Heart. So this is all, and a little bit of that is with me now because I'm wearing, it's called a lavalier microphone, and it's the microphone I used with Barbara Hanna and Marie-Louise von Franz and Dieter Baumann and all the people that when I was doing the sound recording for the productions. So we do have a good presence in terms of film in the relationship to Jung in our community.
So my vision is maybe we do some kind of 2 or 3 2-day weekend seminar where we would have several speakers and then show Michael's film and get Virginia to come up from Atlanta and whatever else. Anyway, that sounds fun to me. So, well, thank you all. And thank you so much, Nonnie and Pete.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure.
Hope to see you again soon.
It's
Bye.
been precious, Nonnie and Pete.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.